Hi, I'm Eric Hutchinson. I'm the principal broker and owner of Hutchinson Realty, and this is video 9 of the Negotiating Your Next Home video series. I hope you'll watch the other videos in the series, but today we're going to be talking about seller's disclosure. So, does the seller have to fill out a disclosure form and give to the buyer? And do all buyers want to receive a seller's disclosure from the seller? So, those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Let's talk about the first question that I raised. The seller does not have to legally fill out a seller's disclosure. However, they are supposed to disclose any information that can impact the marketable value of the property. For instance, if there has been a hole in the roof and there water intrusion and there's been mold in the house, something like that, the seller should disclose that to the buyer. However, there's nothing by law that requires the seller to fill out a document that discloses that to the buyer. Now, realtors usually recommend to the seller that they fill out a seller's disclosure, a document to give to the buyer and have the buyer sign that saying that they've seen that disclosure because that protects the seller. Anything that the seller discloses to the buyer and there's proof that they disclosed it, that will really strengthen any kind of legal action that might be taken in the future about some of those items that the seller has disclosed. So I'm going to flip over to page 8 on the real estate contract and let you take a look at these different options that buyers have in regards to the seller's disclosure. Option number A says that the buyer is going to sign the seller's disclosure and they have received a seller's disclosure. And then whatever date is on that seller's disclosure, you would put in the date there. And so if there's a seller's disclosure already on file and the buyer has received that before they have signed the contract, they would check letter A. Now, letter B says that the buyer has not received a seller's disclosure, but they are requesting a seller's disclosure from the seller. And the seller has 3 days to fill it out. And if the seller does not fill out the disclosure or provide a seller's disclosure to the buyer can terminate this real estate contract. So it's a contingency that's put on the contract if you check letter B. And once the buyer has received it within that 3 business days, they have an additional 3 business days to review that seller's disclosure and decide whether or not they want to accept it and move forward. So it does put a contingency, and that's something that you might want to think about when negotiating a real estate contract or making an offer on a house. You can check letter B, and if the seller doesn't provide you the seller's disclosure within 3 business days, you can terminate the real estate contract. Now, item number C is interesting. It says that although a disclosure may have been completed or can be completed, by the seller, buyer has neither received nor requested or does not desire a seller or written disclosure concerning the written condition of the property. Now, why do you think that a buyer wouldn't want a seller's disclosure from the seller? Well, an investor that is buying a house, maybe the house is in really bad repair and the buyer wants to fix the property up and resell it. We call that a flipper. They're going to flip the house and sell it. They may not want to know anything about the property because if they know something about the property that it could impact the value, they have to then disclose that to the future buyer that they are trying to flip the house to. So sometimes the investor doesn't want to know whether or not there's been anything happening with the property or if there's been anything negative on the property, because if they find out about it, they have to legally disclose it. So some investors don't want to know about the property if there's been any negative things that could impact the value. They just say, I don't want a seller's disclosure, and they check item number C. So let's look down at item number D. That's the last choice. So on item number D says the buyer understands no disclosure form is available. Now, what that means is, so if the house is a repossessed house, a repossessed property, like the bank owns the property, most banks will not fill out a seller's disclosure. If it's owned by HUD, the Housing and Urban Development from the government, if they have repossessed the house for whatever reason, they don't really know the history of that property and they're not going to fill out a seller's disclosure. And so they don't know anything and they're not going to disclose anything. So the buyer understands that no disclosure form is available and will be filled out by the seller. So a little bit of difference on items C and D. C, the buyer doesn't want it. D, the seller doesn't fill one out. So those are the four different options that you have. Now, we always, as realtors, recommend that you, as the buyer, get a seller's disclosure so that you know about the property, know the history about the property. We always recommend that the seller fill out a seller's disclosure to protect them from liability. But sometimes there is no disclosure. What we always recommend, and if you noticed over there on page 8, at the bottom of paragraph C and the bottom of paragraph D, it says buyer is strongly urged by selling firm and the listing firm to make all independent inspections deemed necessary prior to signing this real estate contract. Basically, it says you'd better get a home inspection and check out that property as good as you possibly can, because there is no disclosure, or you're not asking for a disclosure. You better make sure that there's nothing behind the walls or there's nothing around that property that could impact the value of that property. There's nothing more disappointing for a buyer to find out after they have purchased a house that there was something not disclosed to them, or if there's something that impacts the value of the property. So always do your research. And I would recommend to the buyers that they always get a seller's disclosure to see if there is anything that may impact the value of the property. So those are the things that we recommend, and I hope this helps you have a better understanding of seller's disclosure. You can always reach out to me at info@hutchrealty.com, or you can visit our website at hutchrealty.com, where you can view every listing in Northwest Arkansas. So I hope to hear from you. You can always message me from this video, and I will see you next time on video 10. Have a blessed day.